Hi everyone, Season 9 is just around the corner, and as always we have the updated tier lists for you. So I want to go through them briefly, just talk about a little bit my thought and like some of the background behind it, because usually just seeing the picture doesn't really always do it justice. But it is definitely worth noting that Season 9 does look completely different from what we have seen before, so at least Blizzard has successfully shaking up the meta quite a lot, and every class, for example, has new top tier builds. Well, with that being said though, some classes actually just kind of went down in power a little bit. But with that being said, I did make another video talking about the paid scaling that I believe might not actually be that bad after all, because, well, likely we're just gonna end up being buffed compared to before. So just as a quick TLDR, there is a pit scaling of 23% as far as we know right now per tier, and Blizzard has said in the patch notes that they are reducing the HP scaling for monsters. And even if they do a very slight adjustment, like 1 or 2% per tier, you'll probably end up in a scenario where effectively every build got buffed, even those that were nerfed a lot in those patch notes. So I'm kind of excited to see how many builds we will be able to play when it comes to like Torment 4 content, and it's just generally going to be easier, I feel, despite all the nerfs. So just kind of like as a bit of a preface here, but let's jump into the tier list. So we have the typical build tier list here. We have Endgame and Pit Push. This is like one combined tier list for these things. Then we have the leveling, the speed farm, and the bossing, and we also have the uniques and runes. I'm going to be mostly talking about the Endgame tier list because that's usually kind of like the main one here where you also pay the most attention to, just to kind of like replicate the power that the builds actually have. And well, we have a lot of Spiritborn, turns out. So Spiritborn is back. This is thanks to the new Balazan's Noctilateral Pants that they have introduced, and that actually brings us 3 separate builds that are all pretty similar in how they are actually set up, but they do play quite different. So we kind of decided to just take the existing Rake and Thrash guides, because they were like, you know, down here somewhere, and actually just kind of make them into reasonable versions of this new unique item. And it turns out, well, we have some pretty interesting top builds here. So this is like a Thorns slash poison build. I can just show this real quick here. So this new item. And it turns out that this is going to be the highest pushing setups in the game, the way it looks right now. So even though these pants got target nerfed and there were some other little tweaks, we do expect that the 3 builds on the Spiritborn here will push the highest. So I spent a lot of time writing the quill guide, and then we kind of made similar versions for Rake and Thrash here. But yeah, I'll have a full dedicated guide video on this as well, but you can obviously check out these new builds down here on Maxroll already. Now, one thing to note here though is that most of these Spiritborn builds are that high because of some double dipping. So there is some bugs with the Jaguar main hall. This is also explained here. For example, there are certain multipliers that get multiplied again when you have the Jaguar hall proc, which is this effect here. And a lot of builds actually lean to this for pushing. And this also means that in general, Spiritborn is going to be on a actually more comparable power level as the other classes when Jaguar Hall is not used, or in case there is a fix for this. Now, I do believe a fix is relatively unlikely during Season 9 because we reported this like way before the season, and it seems like that has consciously decided not to fix this. So I think this is going to be something for Season 10. But keep in mind that this could happen, and there might be a drop in power if that happens. It's not going to be like unplayable or something like that, but it does definitely contribute to some of this like really high-end power that the Spiritborn has here. And on top of this, you also have to rely on relatively clunky mechanics with the Quax rune and also the Mystic Circles in particular. So this kind of goes into many of those pushing setups, and in like typical farming scenarios, it's actually much more reasonable. Then some other top builds here. We have the Shadow Blight Necro. So apparently, I think Macro is cooking something there or so. But yeah, they buffed some stuff on a Necro. The key passive can now actually be a thing. So this is kind of like a, I think, Corpse Explosion, proc, Shadow Blight kind of build or so, as far as I'm aware. I haven't actually seen it yet, so this is like not ready, but will be very soon. You'll see there's like a few of these like grayed out builds that are just not published just yet, but most of the stuff is there. So we're gonna see the rest as the next 1 or 2 days progress, basically. Necro in general, no surprise, is really powerful. We had many strong builds on the Necro, and well, some of them were nerfed. So for example, Bloodwave as well was like kind of target nerfed with the orbs. So unfortunately, it's going to be like a really kind of like clunky build to play. This is effectively just a pushing build, and that's about it. And well, we have kind of like similar story in some cases with something like Bone Spear as well that kind of got weaker and especially more clunky. So if you want to play something that it was already kind of like clunky enough to just be a pit push build and not really anything else, and now there's even more so. So yeah, the kind of same thing applies to these Balazan builds here. They're mostly like very push oriented setups, and in like other scenarios, I think the balance between the classes is actually going to be much more reasonable. Now with that being said, we can talk about A tier. We have actually a change on the Rogue. So after 3 seasons of Death Trap, we actually have a pretty competitive other setups now, because Death Trap got a bit of a nerf, and also like for example the overpower dropped much lower. So across the board, overpower has lost a lot of value, which is something that Death Trap was doing pretty well, like Sunrune for example, but also many of the other builds went down here, yeah, largely due to bug fixes or the overpower changes where we have no longer any additive extra damage scaling. So this affects especially druids and barbs. So this is why you don't really see much of those here in SNA. But there is also, you know, bug fixes like on the Sork, for example, with Enlightenment was buggy. The Combustion key passive was also buggy. So there were several effects here that leads to all these like big down arrows here. But yeah, this is kind of what we got here. In the end, we have every class represented at least in S or A when it comes to pushing, besides the Barb. They are definitely noticeably weaker than the other classes the way it looks like, but they also have been cooking, so maybe there's some stuff you might move up a little bit. And you might actually have like at least one of each class or so here in this territory at the very least. But to talk about this here a little bit, this is definitely something I'm excited for. Penshot Rogue. So there is some cooking that we have done with Azarath, and that was already a thing, for example, for Ice Shards in Season 8. Now it has crept into a lot of the rogue builds, so we have one here that is going to be really good and really fun. Then we have the same here on the Twisting Blades, but there's also the Poison Twisting Blades. We have the classic Death Trap, just a bit weaker, and we also have other rogue builds that can do this like whole Azarath route. In fact, I think it goes so far that even the Barbs are considering making something like an Azarath build, and we have something like, you know, Ice Shards, etc. So there are many builds like that. I think also like Chain Lightning does that. Like building around procs, building around this weapon in order to get a lot of damage. So kind of important to keep in mind, this is you know, something that kind of scales up a lot as you get better gear, especially a better Azarath that you did Masterwork, and then you also scale a lot of attack speed. So it's not something you just equip some random item power 750 Azarath on the Torment 4. So you have to try a little bit with those builds. But at the very least, it's mostly focused on one item that you have to try to get right. Then we have some builds that are pretty good that just work. So we have the Hydra Sork, effectively like a minion Sork, and also the minion Necro, both here pretty far up. So these are going to be pretty popular builds, I think, for both these classes. Hydra is like a new hype thing. I expect probably Hydra to be the most played build out of everything here, because, well, we have Spiritborn, which is, you know, the somewhat kind of like, you know, mostly push oriented, kind of also a bit difficult to be honest, because it's not very defensive. And then you have Hydra that just kind of works, minions that just kind of works. So pretty chill play styles to just decimate everything. And you can not really go wrong with these. So that's kind of good here. For the druids, it did look kind of despair, but on the other hand, we do have a few builds that kind of crept up here anyway. We have the Flesh Runner Druid. This is the old so-called Singer Druid. We are finally making a guide for that. That used to be some kind of like very niche, weird build that yeah, was just like played by very few, but now it turns out to be the strongest druid build. So that is coming. It's based on Bulwark as far as I know, so you can like just spam your defensive skills to get these like AoE procs from this unique. And this is how that build works. Relatively good in AoE, but not that great on single target. But it does push pretty high in the end. There's also Companion, there's also Pulverize, so the Rotting Lightbringer new two-handed unique mace is really powerful, and it seems like this might make Pulverize relatively solid to play, and I'm actually excited. I'm probably gonna make a druid as my second class just because I want to play this. So let's see. Yeah, and then we have a bunch of other stuff up here that is like nothing really new. So there are other builds here on some of the other classes. Chain Lightning, Meteor or Sorg are looking pretty solid as well. So you have a bit of variety here as well. It's not just like Lightning Spear or Bust on a Sorg. In general, Lightning Spear is kind of far down. It got pretty heavily nerfed, but I think it will get to the point where it's still going to be ridiculous when it comes to like Torment 4 farming, for example. At least once you have the full setup and you're like pretty well geared. But yeah, overall, a completely new meta here, I guess, on the Stork. We have a bunch of variety on the Rogue, on the Druid. So it is looking kind of interesting here. And also Curl has a bunch of other builds that are pretty interesting. In particular, Evade is going to be an important one here. Evade is what I'll be starting. We also have a fresh leveling guide for Evade as the best leveling build in the game. And we also like put it pretty far up now for push and for speed farm. It's like one of the top builds out there when it comes to just like overall performance. And well, yeah, we have been kind of cooking here and it's looking really good for this. So if you want to get started, have an easy time and blast through everything, then this is a really good choice. Now we can go down a little bit here to B tier. So B is the barb tier basically. You see here, like there's a lot of barb. Yeah, basically everything kind of went to the same tier, which is interesting. So barb is actually the only like really balanced class, let's say, and they actually managed to kind of bring the earthquakes to the level of the other builds. Now, I guess a lot of people will feel pretty bad about this, but as I had mentioned before, it also could be that we are just going higher tiers and easier in Torment 4 and so on anyway, thanks to the revised pit scaling. So I'll just wait and see. And I don't think it's going to be as bad as it actually looks right now. And in the future, where, for example, they fix the Jaguar Hole double dipping bugs, we're also going to see like a lot of Spiritborn stuff drop, probably at least one tier or so. And who knows, maybe they're going to fix Azurath bugs and then all the stuff is also going to drop. And we're actually probably moving more towards kind of like this territory in terms of like where the power level of the overall builds are landing for the future. It's like at least my expectation right now. I think Blizzard is trying to reduce power levels a little bit, try to bring it back to more reasonable levels, and especially kind of like cut back on some of the like really crazy high end, you know, scaling out of control kind of builds that do trillions of damage or something like that. So I think that long term we're gonna end up with more builds somewhere in this range. B tier is populated with kind of like okay builds, but you know, nothing really crazy. So yeah, I expect it's gonna be fine to play any of those, even maybe all the way down here. But yeah, some of them will probably start feeling kind of sluggish when it comes to like Torment 4 layer bosses, and you probably have to have relatively good gear in order to take on those, for example. So this is kind of like with this territory here, I believe. Whereas like most of these builds here probably have a relatively easy time progressing to Torment 4, taking down the layer boss Torment 4, and then also eventually level the glyphs to 100, for example. But yeah, in the end, I always make a bunch of these builds that are also down here as well, and it usually always works. That's why we have the guides for those. So we do have, you know, some of those B and C tier candidates that are still just like really fun builds. So something I'm looking forward to, for example, is Razor Wings that got pretty heavy buffs. So I'm definitely going to be trying that out, for example. Lunging Strike, I think that's going to be cool, and you're going to be zooming around with the barb. So I'm going to make that for sure. And well, there's a bunch of other like kind of like, you know, revised builds, maybe new setups and so on, all over the place here. So there, in general, like all this like basic skill barb stuff is landing here as well. There's Frenzy, there's Bash, maybe that even goes up a little bit further. And yeah, it's going to be kind of interesting to try some of these builds down here. And then we have C tier and D tier. So they're kind of like mostly old, nerfed, or somewhat forgotten builds, or bug fix builds like, you know, Lightning Spear and, you know, bunch of the Sorg stuff and so on. So they're just kind of like not really in a very great territory. But if you're really, you know, enjoying some of those setups, then here you go. Now I want to briefly talk about some of the other tier lists as well. So speed farming, for example, we have this list as well. So it does look quite different because here we don't really rank by power. We rank by, you know, for example, Torment 4 and low pit tier, XP farming capacity and so on. So this looks quite different. So Sorg is, yeah, the king here most of the time because of teleport, especially late game when you have all the cooldown and Shaco and you just teleport every single attack, then you go pretty fast, turns out. And even stuff like, for example, Lightning Spear is going to end up somewhere up here. We also have Evade. I talked about this. This is just kind of like working from the start. So this is going to be really nice if you want to just blast all the way from 1 to paragraph 300 if you want. And then we also have a bunch of stuff here on the Rogue. So The fast classes go fast. I guess that comes as no surprise. Even Cataclysm Druid is up here, interestingly, because it just hits the entire screen, and despite the heavy nerfs, will get to the point where it will actually just like blast through Torment 4, for example. And then we also have like the A tier with like a bunch of other builds. So there's also barbs represented here, for example. We're zooming around with like Leapquake or Lunging Strike, for example. Then there's a bunch of stuff here with Druids and a lot more like Sorc, Rogue, and Spiritborn builds, just because they go pretty fast. On the other hand, for example, Necro, despite being high up there on S and A tier on the pushing, it's just not really a fast class, has clunky mechanics, and nothing has really changed about this. So a lot of the Necro stuff is relatively low on the speed farming side, for example. So there's strengths and weaknesses to each of those classes. We also have the bossing tier list here. This is largely a representation of DPS. So it is somewhat similar to the Endgame and Pit Push tier list, because that also focuses a lot on just like, you know, highest output basically. But there are some builds that will have a bit of an easier time than others when it comes to like taking down stuff like Luriel, Belial, and so on Torment 4. But overall, you have a similar picture, at least, compared to the endgame tier list here. And lastly, the leveling builds. So for this 1 to 60, get started with the season. We have this here. So we have Spiritborn at the top. So this guide is going live very soon. But we also have other decent stuff on most of the classes here. So there is a lot of stuff on the Sorc, mostly based on Shocking Impact familiars, for example. Necro is just kind of a strong by default. Dance a Nice Rogue, still really good despite some nerfs. That was previously the Undisputed King. But yeah, you're gonna have a pretty chill time, even going into Penitent difficulty on most of these setups if you get a bit lucky. And otherwise, probably at least Expert, when then blasting to level 60 in a few hours or so, is going to be pretty easy on most of the stuff. And then we have like the other classes here as well. There's like a lot of Barb stuff here in A and Druid, and so on. So that's about it here for our tier list. So let me know what you think. I gotta say, it is definitely an interesting shakeup. I like to see that we have a new meta at least for all of the classes. So that is nice, because previously it has been kind of like very stale for 2 seasons in a row where we just got the same stuff every single time basically. And now, well, it does make me excited to play some of those builds here. So I'm definitely going to be doing Rake, Penshot, and yeah, you know, something like Pulve and a Lunge. So cool stuff here that I'm looking forward to personally. And let me know what you are playing or what you are excited for. We also have a runes and a unique items tier list that we updated just to kind of like represent the overall value and usability and how popular some of those choices are. So that might give you a bit of an idea of like which drops to look for and you know, which ones to maybe try to sell and so on. So there has been quite a shift here with some of those uniques going up and down. You see here lots of arrows. I'm not going to go through this now, but it might help you out to kind of get a bit of an idea and what items to look for. So that's what I got here for now. Hope you enjoyed my tier list overview. Stay tuned for some more videos. I have plans to update a bunch of like video guides of mine from old builds. And of course, I'm going to make some new ones as well, like the Balazan stuff, the Azure stuff. There's a bunch of builds I want to play that I have been cooking as well. And stay tuned for that. So hope you liked this and see you guys next time.